All right. Hello, everybody. This is Martha Alter Hines again. And today I have yet another beautiful, wonderful treat. We're going to be having a conversation with Jonathan Koe, who many of you are already very familiar with and love. And the reason that I asked Jonathan to do this interview, I knew that I wanted to do this when I asked you, Jonathan, but then since then, in the last few days, the world has had things transpiring that make this conversation even more, I would say, compelling and even more alive in myself, and I think in you, of why the conversation we're about to have, I think, is perfectly timed in this moment. So what we're here to talk about is Mars. And the reason, just to give context for all of you why we're having this conversation, is because, what was it, 2 weeks ago, Jonathan, you co-led the
eclipse panel.
Right. And at the very end, you mentioned, maybe even after we stopped recording, you mentioned that you were about to be leading your own Mars series.
It's actually, it's an 8-week container.
8-week container. Okay, beautiful. And and I immediately perked up, and the other people perked up. Wait a minute, Jonathan doing something on Mars? That just right there, that is, enough to really catch my attention. And then I just had this immediate feeling, oh, wait a minute. First of all, I want to know more about that. But second of all, I want to know, what is Jonathan's perspective on Mars? Really, And for any of you who were part of the Rebecoming the One symposium, Jonathan also was my co-facilitator for the week on the divine person. And you can still, it's all still free. You all can still go back and watch the whole month-long symposium anytime you want. But when we were focused on the divine person, we were really focusing on more of the non-binary, the gender fluidity aspect of gender. We weren't really focused. There was a full week on the divine feminine, a full week on the divine masculine, and then our week, your week with me, came after those two focuses more on the polarities, and we were really holding space for the non-duality, the non-polarity, the whole, all of it. Yes, the complexity of all of it. So then when we now are about to open up this conversation about Mars, it's just such a different, you could say it's more focusing on one end of the polarity, or not, or, but that's where my mind immediately goes, right? So, so this is a really different kind of conversation for the two of us to be having. And there's so much here, especially given what is currently happening in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel so many directions we can go, but would it feel right to you to just take a moment to sit here and even center together for just a brief second? Because I can even feel in my own body, my own activation with, when I think of Mars, it's really easy to get activated in myself. So and I could even just invite everybody listening to come into our bodies and just be in that still, present place. So Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you, Martha. And I really honor your knowing and your impulse in that moment to allow us to kind of make a little bit of extra space, because I think that's precisely a lot of the work that I've been doing with Mars in the past few years, that I'm now inviting people into with this 8-week container, I feel like what I want to share with you about the container, but also about my working with Mars in general, is that for some reason, when this idea of this offering came to me, my first response was no. Like I didn't want to do anything. I didn't want anything to do with Mars, which I think is understandable probably for a lot of people who are listening to this, a lot of people who are in your community. I think a lot of us have experienced really unrefined, harmful, violent expressions of Mars, somewhere along the lines. And also, for me, I realize I'm coming to a moment where it wouldn't be right anymore for me to continue to perpetuate within myself this idea of Mars that is very one-sided, right? That is very much rooted in how the collective has presented it or has rather distorted it, and to continue to push away my own wisdom, my own martial wisdom. And I realize and I want to center the fact that for me, Mars is deeply related to my ancestry and to my own people.
Can I pause you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Just that, what you just said, your own martial wisdom.
Mm.
I feel like I need to pause that moment because
Yes, let's
wow,
pause.
wow.
Mhm,
I mean, like, yes, right? What if
mhm.
we each could find like that martial wisdom? I mean, I'm like on the verge of crying because the bombings that just happened in Israel, right? If we could,
Yeah.
if our whole world could just pause and be with the wisdom, like our martial, literally our martial wisdom,
Mhm.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to validate that, Martha, because to me, a big teacher for me at this very moment, as we're speaking, is actually Mars in Cancer. And in
Mhm.
traditional astrology, Mars is fallen in Cancer, right? But I've been thinking about specifically, with everything that's been going on in the world, how, I see a lot of messages in social media about violence and justifying violence because there was no other option. And I've been thinking for me personally about the times in my life where I have no choice and how the moments when I had no choice and the actions that had to come from that doesn't mean that the action that comes from that place of no choice was actually the right action, right? My no choiceness is actually separate from the action being justified or not justified. So I
Mhm.
just want to presence that because that's something that I've been really sitting with, and it feels really thorny. Mars can bring up a lot of thorns, right? Mars brings up for me the violence that I've endured that has made me believe on a deep level that violence towards myself or violence towards the world is justified. This
Mm,
to me is the heart of the martial wisdom, right?
mm, mm, mm.
How do you separate? How do you separate that this experience of violence happening to you or something unpleasant happening to you, something hurtful happening to you, and then you using that, or we, or one using that as justification um, for certain behaviors, you know? Yeah.
Yes. And you were
Mhm.
about, before I interrupted you, you were about to speak about Mars and your ancestry. I'm like
Yeah.
curious. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. For me, I also consider my inner child to be my ancestor because my inner child came before me,
Mm-mm-mm.
as well as my parents, right? And for me, I was a very martial child. I had a lot of energy. Everybody was trying to dominate me, right? Again, in traditional astrology, we see Mars labeled as the lesser malefic and Saturn as the greater benefic. And I think it's so funny that our response to Mars is always to try to shut it down. Like, shut it down right now, shut it down right now, right? We try to Saturn our Mars. And this was my experience with a lot of people in my life. But the one person who didn't try to shut me down was actually my mom. My mom, when I was in pre-K, my mom used to get called into the school all the time because my teachers were always saying, Jonathan can't sit still. And my mom was like, what are you supposed to do? You know, like, here's this little child with a lot of energy. We're just going to let them be them, you know? And so it's interesting for me to be thinking about my own lens and perspective and experience with Mars being so deeply tied actually to teachers who are in female bodies. My first Mars teacher was my mom. And then I remember watching Sailor Moon, which I have been jokingly saying that was my first astrology course.
Wait, say it again.
watching
What was
watching
it?
Sailor Moon, the anime. I don't know if you know, it's like this
Mm-mm.
cartoon anime that was really popular in the 90s.
Mm.
And Sailor Moon was about this girl who got picked to be someone who like saved the world essentially from evil. And her whole team was there was at first Sailor Moon, and then there was Sailor Mars, there was Sailor Venus, there were all these different essentially like female warriors. You should check it out, definitely.
Yeah.
It's such a great show. But I remember being so drawn when I was a child to Sailor Mars. So I think I'm really bringing in all of this, as well as the influences of the different teachers that I've had the privilege to study from, who are very martial and who are mostly women. And so I really want to, I think, bring and center this way of looking at Mars that is also to kind of use your phrasing terminology that was really connected to the divine feminine too, you know, that isn't just this kind of destructive, very forward facing, yeah, very authoritarian Mars. I think there's many different expressions of Mars. And I think that oftentimes when we identify as artists or as mystics, right, we push away contemplating the martial. And often I think that is part of why maybe the world is still at the level of consciousness that it's currently at, because there's a part of us that I think we are being called at this time, a lot of people who are sensitives, intuitives, mystics, artists, dreamers, right, to really step into what does Mars mean to me? What is Mars inviting me into? And what are the martial embodiments that feel honest and that feel nourishing to me in my work? How can Mars support this already beautiful relationship, right? Commitment we have towards creating a more just world, creating a world where our creativity can flourish, right? Where we are really centered and moving from a space of love. How do we do that? How do we enlist Mars to support us in that journey, right? I want to be very clear that I don't feel that the point of having a devotional praxis or relationship with Mars is to become more martial, actually. I think the point of training with Mars is to allow our Venusian desires or our Jupiterian dreams, right? Or our lunar impulses, to actually move through us in a way that we can give birth to in real time. Because I ultimately, for me personally, when I think about what Mars mean to me, the first phrase that comes is Mars is the river of life, you know? Mars is about the fact that we live in this moment, right? Like right now, I'm talking to you, Martha. I could have prepared all night long for this conversation, but the moment decides, right? In this moment, I don't have a choice. I can only go with the flow of time and the flow of life as it's happening right now. I can only say what feels prescient and what feels important and flowing through me right now. And so I kind of want to bring us back to the beginning of this conversation, where we were talking about the activation that we can feel with Mars. I think a lot of us have been taught in the West, in the healing modalities that we have learned, the idea is always to like down regulate, right? But I'm kind of challenging us here to also notice like what happens if I actually flow with it, right? What happens if I let that aliveness that feels so out of control, what happens when I ride with it and trust that, especially as someone who has been working for many, many years to cultivate compassion, right? To cultivate magnanimity, to cultivate wisdom, that I'm not going to lose control here, right? That actually, as I ride with life, beautiful things can come forward and things can happen relatively quickly too, you know? So I'm going to pause there and because I want to hear what is coming up for you. I feel like I've just said a lot there.
No, it's so beautiful. What's coming up for me is that I'm feeling in myself, my South Node conjunct my Venus in Aries and Chiron. My Venus, South Node, Chiron conjunction in Aries. That's what I'm feeling. And I'm hearing in my mind the I did a lot of work with one particular astrologer. I mean, personal, like where I was the client, right? One-on-one work around my Libra Aries dynamics to sum it up in a very teeny tiny summary. Especially when Pluto was squaring my Venus and squaring my nodes. So a lot was coming up with that whole thing. And what this person said to me repeatedly in most of my sessions essentially was to Saturnize my Mars. He didn't use those exact words, but he would say, okay, yet again, I'm going to say to you, you need to, when you feel that Mars drive to go after the thing, you need to slow down, which I mean, I totally, completely see his wisdom in it. And I can also say that, yeah, I have, I have, a lot of tendency in my life when I'm really clear. I mean, and then my Mars happens to be in Aquarius. So when I'm really clear on what I'm meant to do, I do it. Boom, done. Right. And people, anybody who's watched my life over the last 2 years, you can see that's what I do. I get a lot done really fast and it's just done. Period. The end, which has amazing strengths. And sometimes, especially more on a personal level, I can jump into a situation and go, wait a second, just hang on, I don't necessarily want to do this. I mean, nothing like horrible, but I get his point, right? And yet, there's a Martian wisdom also in that impulse to move. It's not just ignorant, like unthinkingness. There is something in my soul with that flow you're talking about that I'm going down a particular flow. And so anyway, I don't have any conclusions or judgments about any of that. I'm just that's what's alive in me, so I'm naming it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that so much. And I have also been thinking about even just the words themselves, like martial arts, right? A lot of our ancestors have practices that connect to martial arts, and I've been really sitting with what does this look like if we treat the cultivation of our Mars as an art, right? I also one other way that I've been contextualizing Mars is as our unique life force, right? Our Mars is like I've been thinking about this force, you know, like what is that unique life force, right? And one way that I've been contextualizing it is that our unique life force, our chi, our prana, right, is like the way that our cells coalesce in order to knit us into this like unique being that we are. You know, it's like how do my cells know how to interact with one another such that I become Jonathan, and how do your cells know how to be with one another so that they create Martha, right?
Mm.
Two separate beings in two separate spaces. You know, there is something about working with Mars that has to do with knowing precisely how our Mars needs to flow, right? How do we express our Mars in a way that feels right to us? And you know, your Mars in Aquarius, my Mars in Capricorn, in traditional astrology, they're both ruled by Saturn. You know, and there is kind of the Saturnian quality to them. You know, yours is definitely maybe more outward, you know, more diurnal, more yang, right? Mine is more yin, you know, and has this flow to it. But this our Mars, both our Mars have this quality of like premeditation, of contemplation, of discipline too, right? And that's not the case for everyone. You know, some people have their Mars in Aries and they move when it's hot, right? And it's like, how do you work with that really swift movement and to tend to yourself after, right? Because when you have Mars that's ruled by Saturn, you know, like the two of us, maybe it's more the case, not always, right? But maybe it's more the case that the premeditation takes up a lot of space and then the doing just happens really quickly, right? And maybe for Saturnian or Saturn ruled Mars, we don't do a lot of post aftercare. But for others, you know, who have maybe Mars in Aries, you may need to do a lot of post care. You know, you may need to deal with like the activation and maybe even the shame that comes up from, especially if you've been socialized to not be so spontaneous or not to be so rash, right? There can be the mind can really jump in. And so I think again, like cultivating the body, the mind, and really getting to know like what are these responses that come up when I Mars, right? And letting myself really sit with that. You know, I think that's really where a lot of my own lens and my perspective of working with Mars comes from.
Mm. Wonderful. Would
Yeah.
you like to describe? I'm just curious to hear about the actual 8-week container. Do you want to say more about what?
Yeah.
Yeah, what? Tell us.
Yeah. So in this offering, I'm really, you know, there was an image that came to my mind about like my relationship with the participants. And the image that came was that, you know, the participants are really the ones running the marathon. I'm the marker, right? As well as the people standing by the sideline, you know, handing out like water and snacks, right? Like that's kind of how I approach this because it's not really, you know, one thing that I think one of my mentors, Britton LaRue, talked about this in one of her lessons in a course that took a long time ago. She said Mars is such an excellent teacher in real time. Like she was describing how in her own life, often Mars taught her more through transits rather than through um, like natal Mars, right?
Mm.
Like just thinking about sitting with natal Mars is like one approach, but transit and life as they are happening is kind of where the action is, you know,
Mm.
and it's like that's where the martial wisdom lies. And I think that's kind of the philosophy or the approach that I'm holding lightly, where my my goal, my intention is to hold the space, create the structure, right? Again, with my Mars and Capricorn, creating the structure for people to create their own martial practices. So
Mm. Mm.
it will be very experiential, right? It will be actually not very astrological at all. Like I will be sharing a little bit, you know, some reflections on. So each week we're going to be you know, we're inviting in, I'm inviting in a guide, you know, so we start with Mars in Gemini, and then we go to Mars in domicile and in exaltation in traditional astrology. So we second week is we go to Mars in Scorpio, and then Mars in Aries, and then Mars in Capricorn. And then the second half of the course is the mirror image of that. So we will start the second half with Mars in Cancer, and then Mars in Libra, Mars in Taurus, and we're going to end with Mars in Sagittarius, because that's where the container will end. We'll end the container with Mars in Sagittarius. And so each week we'll be feeling into what some of the virtues, what some of the lessons and wisdom of Mars being in each of these places are. And we're going to be approaching it actually not from, you know, kind of an intellectual space so much, but we're going to be working with movements, we're going to be working with energy work, and we're also going to be working with self-inquiry. And something I should also mention is that, you know, I want to represence the teachings of my ancestors, because I come from people who migrated from China, you know, back many, many generations ago. I actually grew up in Indonesia, but my ancestors came from China, and they, you know, one of the energy work tradition in China is Qigong. And if you look at Qigong, Qigong is very much about working with visions, right, of nature and kind of replicating it through movements in the body. And so this is how I'm actually approaching movement. I'm not approaching movement from the perspective of, like, for example, somatic experiencing, where, you know, you have certain very specific movements that you do in order to clear things out or things like that. The way that I approach it is actually through visions, and then we translate it into movement. So in a way, what we're going to be doing for those 8 weeks is to build a set of unique practices that we can use, that are really rooted in and blossoming forth from your own unique perspective. Because what, you know, the movements that may work for me, Martha, is not necessarily the movements that will work for you. You know, we all have different bodies, you know. Even like the group that has coalesced so far, we have quite a range, you know, in terms of age, right? And in terms of like ancestry, and in terms of life experiences, you know. So I'm not going to assume that I know what the right movement medicine is for you, but we're going to be working with it together so that you can have the structures necessary to start to see it beginning to like come up and surface for you. Because my own experience, for example, with Qigong has been really surprising to me, because I grew up in Indonesia, where a lot of my people experience erasure and the need to assimilate. And what I've experienced when I start to come into relationship with some of these ancestral practices is that my body remembers them first.
Wow.
Before my mind is able to be like, oh, these are the rules, right? Or like, these are the philosophy, but my body remembers it first. And so I want to kind of create a space where we all can experiment with that, trusting that our bodies have wisdom that our ancestors have been passing down to us, you know, through our DNA and through our cells.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm thinking about two things. One is the relationship between Mars and Venus, both with movement and body, right? I was realizing, certainly I think of Venus with dance and motion and kind of fluidity and sensuality and all of sexuality, all of it. But and Mars also, of course, is movement, sexuality. But I was just feeling into what the two energies feel like in my own being. And then my other train of thought was also noticing and seeing in myself how, you know, of course, the North Node currently is in Aries, ruled by Mars, and early next year is going to come into a conjunction with Chiron, right? So I'm thinking about ancestral healing, ancestral wisdom, body wisdom, body heal. All of it is just, yeah, it's just there's so much, I think, available to us and alive over the coming months, year and a half,
Mhm.
around this, like coming into our body wisdom, coming into the what is alive, what's that stream of wisdom that wants to move through us, right? And is there a way that that with Chiron being so present, especially next year, um, is there another way of being with our bodies, being with that ancestral wisdom that is still here, right? Literally right here.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I don't know if you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on that, but that's what's up for me.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I think that um, we're moving away, or a lot of us feel the hunger, the impulse to kind of move away from one way of approaching learning and one way of approaching our experiencing, which is, we sit down, we receive a ton of information, right? We read books, and then we uh, begin to unravel that and see how we can apply that in our lives, right? I think that a lot of us are craving another way, which is maybe to give ourselves permission to really be with our human experience, and then to start to allow that to be the first step. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I think that for a long time, for efficiency's sake, right, we used to live in a world where getting information was not easy. If you even think about, like, when I was growing up in the 90s, right, my mom used to sell these like encyclopedias, these huge like sets
Mhm.
of encyclopedias, right, for like extra pocket money, I guess, for our household. And that was really important, at that time, because we didn't have access to information that's literally like right here in our fingertips, right? On Google and Chat GPT and things like that. But I think we're now living in a world where all that information is so easy to access, right? Not saying all of that is correct, but that I think the invitation is more to slow down. It's much harder to be with our experience. I was thinking about how it's been a really long time for me since I was bored, and there's wisdom in that boredom, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that um to kind of maybe tie it back into Mars, I think it can be so easy to live in 2023, or whenever you're listening to this in the future, to almost miss the wisdom of life as it's happening in front of you right now, because you're so busy chasing information, through the million podcasts and YouTube channels and emails and piles of books that are available out there. And again, I don't think that that way of learning, right, is no longer valid, because I think for certain kinds of knowledge, it absolutely is. Like, for example, thinking about, like, how can I read charts, right? How can I start to learn astrology as a system? I think we do need to sit down and read the books, but I feel that where I'm currently being called in my life, and I feel that this has to do with the astrology, but I can't really make sense of it. I can't
Mhm.
contextualize it just yet, but where I'm really being drawn to by my guides and by um, my inner movement and inner impulse is to really work with it holistically, right? Um, and I think for me, again, like, this is so ancestral, because a lot of my ancestors, this is what their spirituality looks like. There was no division between the body and spirit, right? Like, that concept was not really something that um they adhered to. There was definitely gradients, right? There were definitely different, that the spirit world and the body world were different dimensions, but they were always thought to be interconnected with one another. They weren't two separate things. Mhm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
actually, yeah, not surprisingly, it's also what you're saying is tied into what I'm being told to do in my own work over the
Mm.
coming years, whenever. Um, but again, two trains of thought. So one is, as you're describing what you're describing, I'm thinking of myself and how starting in my early 20s. Okay, when I was 21, I took my first Reiki class, right? And then later in my 20s, I studied massage, and I took a break. I was originally a social worker, clinical psychotherapist, and then took a little break, went to massage school, did massage for 5 years, and then went back to being a psychotherapist, social worker, all that. But in my late 20s, when I was focused on doing body work, something that I realized about myself pretty quickly is that when I have my hands on people in particular, I can see the meridians, and I can see the body systems, I can see the organs, I can see, anyway, I have Hygeia conjunct my moon on my ascendant in Virgo, and then Chiron on my south node. I mean, it's like, anyway, hands-on healing is a thing definitely there in me. And so I was really confused when I first realized in my early to mid 20s that I could see meridians. What in the world? I still don't know any other people who do, although I know they exist. And if anybody out there knows someone who does, I would love to know who they are, because for 20 years I've been trying to find other people who do. But what I then read about in, the history of traditional Chinese medicine is that, of course, how did the meridian system get birthed or how did the knowledge of it get birthed? Well, there were people who could see it and feel it and know it, right? That's absolutely a thing. It didn't just get made out of nothing. It's not the figment. Anybody who's gotten acupuncture and been really helped by it, which I certainly have, and lots of people have, it's a real thing, right? So where's the disconnect? Like, why have I had such a hard time finding other people who can see meridians, for example? It's like this disconnect of our consciousness and our body, and related to that, in terms of the work that I'm being called into this coming year, is two main things. One is this Infinite Soul Wisdom Astrology 101 course, which I'm holding. And the way the spirit world is actually having me do it is they're calling it a portal of remembering. So it's meant to be, again, it's, certainly it will include the Pisces equals this, Mars equals this, all of that. But it's really actually more about holding a sacred space for each person to do their own remembering through their being, through their body, through their soul. So that's number one. It totally fits with what you're saying. And then number two, which I find really interesting as you're talking, is on the other side of the work I'm going to be doing is I'm supposed to be holding a container of, the wording isn't quite there yet, but it's essentially a remembering of our our ultimate highest energetic blueprint, right? So originally I was thinking, oh, okay, they meaning the spirit world, wants me to do a chakra healing class or something. And then I got told, nope, no, no, that's actually too formulaic, right? Like, that's too concrete. That's not the point here. The point is actually to hold a container similar to what you're discussing, of helping us each and all to remember on our own highest, most aligned level, what is actually the energetic blueprint that's naturally our divine way, right?
Yes.
And that might change from moment to moment, but there might not be a formula out there that could tell you, okay, here's the chakra system, here's the color that goes with that chakra, here's the, right? It's like a coming into our own container, our own beautiful divine blueprint, which again might be evolving moment to moment to moment to moment, again kind of going with that flow of life. And that there's nobody out there who could tell you precisely the truth for you about you.
Exactly.
So anyway,
I absolutely love those two ideas, Martha. I want to continue talking to you about it in other conversations too, because I feel like it's so potent, and that's I really feel a lot of resonance with that. I'm not surprised, both of us are Virgo risings with Pisces and the seventh house and our descendants.
Mhm.
So, there's like Sun in Pisces. So there's definitely a lot of resonance. But I love that that's what your guidance is pulling you towards, um because I think it's much, much needed. This kind of work is, I think, much needed because um I think systems are great, but I also think that especially a lot of us who grew up in the West, who are trained with the Western system of education, ends up attaching to the systems more than understanding the essence. And I think then there's a bit of a breakdown here, right? So
Right.
I think we're kind of in a moment where we are holding the complexity of the both end. We need to understand the essence before we can fully appreciate the system. I think that's where I see a lot of mismatch, and again, you I was actually curious because you mentioned Reiki. Did you ever work as an energy healer or like in energy healing sessions?
Oh yeah,
Did
yeah.
you,
That's the biggest part of what yeah.
that's the biggest part of what you do, yeah. Because the reason why I asked is because, I was also trained in various different energy healing modalities, but when the person comes to me in a session, all of my education goes out the window.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Right? You're
Totally.
just like really working with whatever you're seeing, whatever's in front of you. And I think that's precisely how it's supposed to be um because everyone's so different and everyone's always changing all the time too, right? And I think again, to kind of tie it back to Mars, this to me is like the flow of life that Mars is teaching us to work with, right? Because nobody here listening will ever wake up on two separate days and feel exactly the same. Like you're kind of never the same being twice.
Yeah.
And I think this is, to me, why working with Mars, there's kind of this call to work with that aspect um of our spirituality, of our lived experience, because I think so many of us have been taught to separate our spirituality from the rest of our lives, right? It's like when you are getting triggered, go back into your room and like, do your somatic exercise or do your meditation. Like this was how I approached it for many, many years, but honestly, Martha, the reality is when my partner said something very triggering, I have 2 seconds to decide what to do about it, right? Like
Or
I
less.
can either,
Yeah.
or less,
Or
like,
less.
I can either respond with my middle fingers, or I can respond by repressing myself, or I can respond by something else, right? Like what happens when I have cultivated enough practices so that I can be nimble in the moment and I
Mm-mm.
can dance with the moment so I can come into like a secret third thing, right? Then
Mm-mm.
none of us can really, using our minds, premeditate. So I think really like the heart of this class is to work with spirituality. And it's funny because it's like I have a hard time languaging this in the course page because I did say, oh, we're going to be engaging with contemplative practices. But I think when I talk about contemplation, I'm not just talking about secluding ourselves from the rest of reality. I think contemplation is always happening, right? We're always kind of in contemplation with life all the time. Like it can be a way of moving through life. So, yeah.
Beautiful. So,
Mm.
okay, so maybe and helping us to come into some kind of closure with this, the big thing on my mind as we're talking right this minute is okay, we're recording this on October 10th, 2023. And so this weekend, 2 days ago, Mars was in an exact square to Pluto. And
Yeah.
Mars is about to enter Scorpio. And in the shamanic astrology version of the Mars cycle, which I am not an expert in, but I know enough to know that Mars is about to go into the underworld in their way of seeing cycles, because it's about to go into its exterior conjunction with the sun. Okay, so saying all of that, We can see very clearly also what, given what happened this weekend in Israel, that those dynamics, Mars squaring Pluto in particular, certainly can play out in the way that a traditional approach to astrology would predict. Lots of volatility, lots of combustible power dynamics, misuse of power, et cetera, all of that, right? Okay, that's true. And what's alive in me, and I think what you're saying is alive in you, is yes, and right, like I'm not going to deny that reality, and let's move into another way, because there are so many other ways to be with these energies. So first of all, is that in alignment with what you are trying to express? Okay. Just double check. Yeah,
absolutely.
And so then following with that, in your work with Mars in this container, and also just in your life in general, what is your ultimate vision or your ultimate goal, in general, and also specifically in how we meet Mars in ourselves, in the world, in life, in these moments, in this time?
Yeah. First of all, that is a great question, and that's such a beautiful question, Martha. I'm really grateful that you asked that question. What's alive for me, as you were asking that, is that to me, working with Mars is to work with the discomfort and the pain of being alive, right? In the past few days, what I continue to hear from my friends, some of whom are, have personal ties to these lands, right, where strife and wars are happening right now, and some of whom are just deeply feeling people, is how hard it feels to be alive, right? The discomfort of being alive. I think that historically, and this may be very much like my own super specific lens, being like a Mars and Capricorn person, very often in life, I think we resort to really violent, really harmful, really destructive expressions of Mars because we don't know how to sit with that pain. We don't know how to metabolize that pain. We don't know how to flow with that pain. And I think what I'm hoping, I'm not a masochist, I promise, but what I'm hoping is for us to actually learn to allow the innate compassion, softness, and deep, deep reassurance and loving towards that part of us that's hurting. So that in that alchemy, right, in the alchemy of the part that's wise and can hold space, and the part that's really hurting, something else can emerge. That I don't think that when we allow these two parts to really come together, I don't think that what will blossom forth is actually violence. I don't think what will blossom forth is actually this desperate move to try to wiggle out of a situation and hurt a lot of people in the act of doing that. So I want to bring us, for some reason, what's really coming up for me right now, Martha, is the Orphic Hymn to Mars. So I'm not going to recite the whole thing, but if you look up the Orphic Hymn to Mars, it's really divided into two sections. The first section, and this is one of my teachers who has really taught me about this and helped me in my contemplation. I want to honor her. Her name is Kristen Mathis, she's a very Venusian person. And I just really love her take on this, because she was really pointing out how the Orphic Hymn to Mars is divided into two sections. The first section was the poet, right, really acknowledging the forcefulness, the war-loving, blood-hungry, bloodthirsty guise of Mars. And then in the second half, it was basically saying stop, and instead play with Venus, essentially have sex with Venus, right? Or go with Dionysus, like have a party with Dionysus, right? Like support that jovial, life-giving, and also, by the way, uh, death, death-friendly or death welcoming rite of Dionysus, right? Because Dionysus is both aliveness and death too.
Mm.
And there's a way in which, with Dionysus, I think it's about Mars can really work with Dionysus to honor the cycle of life, right? That life needs to end in order for more life to come up, not in like a war sense, but in a natural death, natural decomposition way. Or the other option that was given was to collaborate with Ceres and protect the children and protect the people who grow the food, right? And so I think that's really my intention and my heart and my dream with this offering, and with kind of, even if this offering is not right for people at this time, like to invite people into deeper contemplation with Mars, because I think Mars is the one force that really needs wielding, but we can't wield Mars. We can't train with Mars if we are so afraid of Mars. If we're continuing to push our Mars away, if we're continuing to not want to look at our pain, our anger, our frustration, our impulses, right? Where's all of that energy going to go? It's not going to just vanish and disappear, right? We can't pretend that Mars is not part of our aliveness. And so, yeah, I think that also, something I want to say that's really specific to this very moment of, this war that's breaking out is that the truth is a lot of us are really bystanders.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about like how part of being in the right relationship with the world is to sometimes accept that you are a bystander. And so as a bystander, I think a lot of us have deep responsibilities. How do we not approach, right, looking at this event that's happening right now from the perspective solely of our trauma?
Mm.
How can we work, maybe, or if we want to use that lens, how can we work with it consciously? Many of us are here as products of war, right?
Yeah.
A lot of us have been displaced. Our ancestors were displaced from their homeland, and a lot of us uh came here because of violence that happened to people who look like us or people who hold our identities, including sexual identities. And so I want to invite us into working with Mars, because I believe that working with Mars is one of the ways that we can come into right relationship with the more gnarly parts of our experiences, right?
Mm.
That we don't let that run the show unconsciously, but rather we work with it, we work alongside it so that we can see what else can come up. I don't know what that is, right? I mean, here's the pedagogical secret, right? I wanted to start this particular container with Mars in Gemini and Mars in Sagittarius, because I truly believe that how we name our experiences and our beliefs around our experiences really influence how we end up channeling our Mars, how we end up embodying our Mars.
Mm.
I think working with Mercury and Jupiter is such an important part of working with Mars. In
Mhm.
fact, I think working with all the other planets is like what we are really invited into when we work with Mars, right?
Mm.
Like I said, it's not the point of working with Mars isn't to become more martial, isn't to become more ruthless, isn't to become more decisive, or like be this like boss babe. I think that the point of working with Mars is um, to be who we already are. A lot of the people listening to your channel, Martha, I imagine are healers, are people who really want to, are creatives, people who really want to see beautiful things blossom in the world. The point is to have more of that, actually,
Mm.
right? And to not let a lot of this hanging, repressed aggression and impulses kind of stop us from really birthing what's beautiful into the world. And one final thing to say too is that in order for beautiful things to happen in the world, we need that martial energy, right? We need that push. I see you, for example, in organizing Rebecoming the One. I mean, that was a lot of martial invitations, putting
Sure
out
was.
different emails and being like, hey, like, please respond to the form that I sent you. Like, there's something very martial about that too. And I think really like coming into contact and seeing these parts of us, the ways we're already martial, right? And then gently working with them. I'm all about working gently. I'm not here to kind of push people past their, you can already tell probably from my personality, I'm not really someone who's like, yeah. So I think
Yeah.
that's all I want to share. But yeah, thank you for your invitation. And I'm really curious actually to hear your relationship with Mars too, Martha, if you want to share.
That's so interesting, because what I was feeling really called to talk about my own. Here's what I was about to say. I'm really feeling like I, for some reason, need to say before we end. So there you go. You'll get your wish. Yeah, no, right. As you're talking, the other thing that's coming up for me is when you and I last really spoke. I mean, we just had this panel together 2 weeks ago, but the time before that was when we were part of the Rebecoming the One symposium. And what we talked a lot about in that moment was the fact that I had just ended the week on the divine masculine in Rebecoming the One. And that week was very challenging for me and pretty traumatizing. And largely because I would say that a lot of what came up in that week was what I could call the wounded masculine. I don't know what words to put to this, but anyway, something along those lines. And so what has transpired for me since then is that I feel like in myself, I've come to a closure place with a lot of my own karma, my own relationship to, again, what you could call the wounded masculine. I don't really, these words are weird, right? But for lack of better words. And that certainly had a lot to do with my relationship with my dad, who died last December, et cetera, et cetera. But what has been so interesting, I was talking to Chris Skidmore about this the other day. What's been so fascinating to me is that since I kind of had that sense of closure last June, I had been really focused on healing, or holding space for all aspects of the feminine, the masculine, the non-binary, all of us, everybody, to come together, to be heard, to heal, to transform, all of it. That was the whole point of that symposium. But also I'm dedicated to doing that in general. And specifically what was really calling my attention was the holding space for the wounded masculine, or the aspects of maybe people who identify as masculine, or whatever it is, to voice their own needs and their hurt, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So I did that. And I was pretty, a lot of my attention was on that wounded masculine in various ways. But since I felt like I came to closure with that, what suddenly ended up happening actually in my own world is that it's like what I would call more of the positive masculine, just in my own world, in my own life, in my own self, in my family, in my friendships and everything. It just rushed in. It was like, and then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, this has been here this whole friggin' time. I mean, very long story, very short. It's like I realized, okay, my dad was a complex person. There were lots of aspects of him that were definitely representations of that wounded masculine. So that was what I was pretty focused on. But there were parts of him that were also really beautiful and really unconditionally loving and all of that. But both of my grandfathers, beautiful, beautiful relationships to the masculine between me and them, my uncles, my cousins, every other male identified person in my family, so beautifully positive masculine presence for me. And when I would go into my own inner masculine over the last 2-3 years, what I actually discovered with the first time I went and found him was he is a very, very positive masculine presence, right? So it's like my own, again, Mars isn't only masculine, I get that. And also in my own relationship to my Mars, what I realized is that I have this presence in myself of a actually really grounded, patient, magical, wise, unconditionally loving masculine being in me, right? And it's like, because I was so focused on, I needed to heal my relationship with the wounded masculine. I really did. That's a huge part of my karmic thing in this lifetime. But I feel like I've done a lot of it. I'm sure not all of, whatever. I've done a lot of it. And now it's suddenly like this, the positive aspects of the masculine are right here and right in front of me, you know?
Yes.
And not that they weren't there before, they were already always there, but
Yes.
it's like, it's right here now. And it's yeah, it's an ongoing process, but so that's part of what I'm feeling as you're talking about the need to be with, maybe if you want to call it the shadow aspects of our Mars relation, whatever it is, it's not only about, to me it feels like it's not only about suffering and like feeling the pain of it. I mean, that's could be part of it, certainly not to run away from the pain, you know, really meet the pain. And in my own experience, and I think watching other people as well through my life as a therapist and all of it, sometimes also what can happen is that once we do give attention to those parts that are hurting and they are able to heal and come to some kind of closure, suddenly we can have this rushing in of fresh blood, right? That maybe the blood was always there. It's just now we can let it come in and we can be nourished in this way that's, you know, I just never expected. And yet there's nothing new that came, nothing that wasn't there before that's here, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Can I share a reflection, Martha, as a friend?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been kind of watching your work, like how you hold your business from afar. And I've just always marveled at the level of structure that was there, the skillfulness of how you kind of steward your work, and also your level of like an energetic capacity. I think that, you know, this is something that one of my mentors, Ari Felix, and I have been talking about, which is that holding space is actually very masculine. It's not like it's not like this feminine thing, right? Like when you hold space, which you do, Martha, for a lot of the people in your community, it's extremely masculine, because basically you have to be holding the structure for people to be, you know, some people are going to be flowering and some people are barely, you know, pushing up the ground. But to recognize and to honor that everybody's on their own journey, and that journey looks very different from one plant in the garden to another plant in the garden, is like, that is actually a masculine function, you know, if we have to kind of separate it into masculine and feminine. So yeah, I really honor your experience of working with the wounded masculine, and then really seeing this like divine sacred masculine expressions coming in, because I think that the wounded masculine is simply the ignored part, right? Or the repressed part of that sacred masculine. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And something I want to say too is that, you know, if you are listening to this and you are like, you know, I am in a male body, I don't really see myself as like the soft person, you know, but you feel the call to also work with this energy, you know, to work with Mars. I'm really calling you into, you know, into this container, as well as into the larger work, right, that we are talking about here, because your presence is so needed. And it's like, I want to really challenge, especially any male-bodied person listening to this, if there are any. And the only reason why I'm doing this is because I'm also in this process myself. You know, was there a part of you, was there a little boy that you really need to see eye to eye, you know, at this moment, that was feeling rejected in your childhood? Because I think that's a huge part of experience, that my experience that I never really talk about, that I never really look at, you know, that is not really talked about in the collective. Like, a lot of little boys out there, you know, little humans in male bodies, are really born with such incredible reservoir of energy, as well as intelligence that comes with that, you know, overflow of energy, right? And a lot of us were not allowed. A lot of us expressed that, and we were seen as a threat, you know. So I kind of want to uh, give you space, you know, to really contemplate, like, was that part of your experience? You know, what happens if you compassionately, as your adult self now, try to talk to that part of you, you know, and validate that part of you, that you can be here now, you know. I didn't realize this, Martha, but this wounded part was really running the show for me for such a long time. And it didn't show because it wasn't acting up, it was repressing itself, you know. And it was like, from the outside, you know, for people who like look at me and they see that I'm like in a male body, even though I also acknowledge the complexity of my sexuality and my gender identity, they may see me and they're like, oh, you know, what a well-developed male person, you know. But actually, in reality, there was a lot of repression that I was holding, and I'm still working through that. And I think that so many of people who are in male bodies just don't know how to deal with it. And I feel very passionate about, like, holding space for whoever needs space held for this kind of work to happen, you know. And I also really trust that the group that is coalescing will also hold you in this process, you know. So
yeah. And also, last thing I feel called to say is, as I've been in my own process with, you know, closing my cycle of karma with the wounded masculine, that whole thing. So a really close friend of mine, one of the only people I've really, you know, really gone into depth with about my process with the whole thing, I was saying to her a month or two ago, yeah, I think I'm done. I'm done with my relationship. This is the way I put it. I'm done with my relationship to the wounded masculine. She said, can I offer you a reflection on this? I said, of course. And she said, I wonder if it's not so much that you're done with your relationship to the wounded masculine. It's more actually, maybe you're ready to move on to you're ready to move on from giving any of your power or your sense of self-value to the wounded masculine. And I went, boom, there we go. That's it. Yes, because I am not, and none of us can really be ever, like, that's not the point here. We're not done with our relationship to the wounded masculine. I realized immediately when she said that, no, wait a second, you're right. That's such a big no. I'm not. We can't be. How can we be, right? So speaking for myself, but I think it's so parallel to our whole world and even what's happening in the world right this minute. It's not that we need to reject a big segment of our own masculine and masculine in the world. That's not the point. The point is to come into a different relationship within ourselves to that energy in ourselves, in the world, etc. So it doesn't need to dominate us. It doesn't need to define who we are. It doesn't need to, you know, again, speaking in my relationship to it, how I used to feel was more like looking to that wounded masculine for approval or blah, 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 right? And so that's what I'm coming to closure with, is my own relationship to it, not the quality of the relationship, not the fact that it exists, right? I don't need to just reject the whole thing. It's really actually reorienting in me what is
how you
my
relate
way
to
of
it.
responding. Yeah.
Yes,
And I feel like
absolutely.
yeah, if we start rejecting it, you know what happens.
Mhm.
That doesn't go very well. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And at the same time, putting up boundaries around it is not
Yes.
rejecting it, even though feelings of rejection will come up.
Yes.
You put up the boundaries,
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. Beautiful.
Mm.
Okay. Um, so unless there's some other thing you feel called to say, I would love for you to share the logistics, the Virgo part.
Mhm. Yeah, the Virgo part.
Yeah,
Awesome.
the dates, the when and the where and the how and yeah, go for it.
Yes. So it's for 8 weeks. We start on October 24th. We meet every Tuesday night, Eastern time, 7:30 to 9:30 Eastern, for 2 hours. I am calling them practice sessions because that's what they really are. They're not really lectures. They're not really classes. We're going to be practicing together for 8 weeks. And technically, registration is going to be open until whenever I feel this is the first time I'm running this particular container, like this particular iteration of the container. So I'm really feeling into, does this feel like the right size? When it gets too big, I'm going to close it up. So technically, it's going to be open until like the night before. But if you know that you're really called to it and you really are in like wanting to engage with this work specifically, like I really call you in. I want to, I welcome you to check out my podcast. Like just feel into my vibe, but know that this is the work. This is work that you're going to be doing for yourself. This is not really about me. I'm just really holding the space. Um, Two things maybe to keep in mind until October 12th, which is when Mars enters into Scorpio. Like before Mars enters into Scorpio, anybody who gets in while Mars is still in Libra, I'm giving a little Venusian gift, which is a 5 to 10 minute audio. I'm calling them love letter to your natal Mars, which I'm going to give at the end of the container. I feel like, when we're working with Mars, we just need all of the other allies to be in the space with us too. So that is going to be present. So if you know you want to do it and you're the kind of person who's motivated and incentivized by gifts, do it before October 12th. But I also am very anti-urgency. So there's no like early bird, there's no discounts. I just create 3 tiers and you can choose in those 3 tiers what feels right to you at this moment. Because yeah, that's how my nervous system likes to roll. And so I'm kind of providing that to people too. Yeah, that's about it. And if you ever have any questions, Martha will share all of my links. Just find me in one of the things. Mhm.
Beautiful. And do people need to be there live? Will it be recorded? What's that?
Great question. This is how I've been answering this, actually. That's such a fabulous question, Martha. I would say this is a self-leadership container. Feel into how you work best. I personally am like a live person. If I don't do the class live, I probably won't do it. But I'm not imposing that on you, right? Like you might be the kind of person who's like the group energy is too intense. I want to do it by myself. Do that, but commit to it. I think that what I want to invite people into is to really feel into like what level of participation feels right to me, but also can I expand my comfort zone, right? Can I really step into maybe what doesn't feel super, comfy for me, right? What happens when I let myself ride that wave a little bit, So the answer is no. It will all be recorded. And again, like Martha, I'm a Virgo rising, so I will create very specific and very like clear packets about like this is what you need to do if you miss class. I also am designing the experience such that each week is definitely there is continuity, but they don't really build on top of one another. So if you miss class or whatever and you don't have time to catch up, you just jump right back in. Because I really want people to just participate and focus on the work rather than do the whole like, oh, I missed class, I can't come because blah blah blah. Like we're not doing that in this class. We're all adults, and we're going to learn as adults. And this is really a space where I'm inviting you to like feel into like how do you want to engage with this work, and yeah, it's a lot of prompts. It's a lot of you engaging with the work. I think the benefit of coming live is that there's just that group energy that sometimes for some of us are really, really helpful. I'm one of those people. I love being in groups because otherwise I just don't do the work sometimes. So.
Well, and I would say one benefit of coming live with you is that you get you. So,
Yes.
I can just say, anybody who has seen the past interviews that Jonathan and I have done together, especially the one where you interviewed me, actually you've interviewed me twice. Both times you have interviewed me. Oh, wow. I mean, it's an exquisite experience to be held in a container with you, Jonathan, really, truly. And, again, I've said this so many times. How many people have said to me, I love Jonathan so much. Yeah, and there was one person, I can't remember their exact words, but it was hilarious. It was in a circle with multiple people, and one person, we were talking about the Rebecoming the One talks, and one person said, oh, and then there was this one person, can't remember their name, but it's like they start talking and it's like you're suddenly enveloped in the arms of the divine, or something. It was something, it wasn't those exact words, but it was something along those lines. And then another person jumped in and said, oh, you mean Jonathan? And then the first person was, yes, Jonathan. What? Like, wow. Okay, then. Like, they're feeling the same thing with you, right? Like, they're having that same something, whatever that quality is just, yeah. Quite remarkable. And I partially wanted to do this interview with you because I feel so 100,000% like I can trust my beloved people in my community to the arms of you, right? And so I know they're in amazing hands, and I don't do that lightly. Like, I'm not going to do this for anything and everything I hear out there. So yeah.
Thank you.
So I highly endorse you. Yeah.
I'm just so grateful to hear that. I feel very honored. And there's also a part of me that's like, what? They're talking about me? I'm like, that must be, they got the wrong person. So
no.
Yes.
They got the right person. And I can hear, like my kids in the background in my own head, like, how many people think of you like XYZ, they don't know the real you. Like, well, multiple sides to all of us.
Yes, we're complex beings, for sure. Yes.
Yeah, but I can affirm that I totally see in you what they see in you, and you are a gift. So
thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Any closing words? Does it feel
No, just so much gratitude for you, Martha. Thank you for making space for this conversation. I feel this kind of huge relief actually talking to you, because I felt, over the weekend with everything that's going on in the world, there's definitely like an inner critic part of me that's like, who wants to do a Mars class, looking at this, right? That's happening in the world. And I think I just feel so encouraged by your presence and by your trust and by your friendship. And I just really appreciate you and honor your work and your presence so, so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's a uncanny, not a coincidence timing. That's what I think.
This is what happens when you are trying to talk about an offering during an eclipse. I'm vaguely remembering this is like not my first time doing something like this, so I'm always like, what are you doing, kid? Like, you're always doing this to yourself. But I don't know. I felt very pulled towards doing this offering. This is the first offering I'm sharing publicly that is like really just held by me, and I think there's also intelligence in there. Yes, other than readings. This is the first like group offering that I'm doing that's just held by me, because I usually love collaborating so much, but this one was just coming in really hot and wanted to, like, Mars was like,
Mars.
this is you, boo.
Mars.
This is you.
Yeah, that's Mars. Your Martian intel, your Martian wisdom, literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Wow.
it feels so meaningful that you offered to hold space for this conversation. And yeah, I feel really, really grateful. Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful too. And it just, yeah. Anyway, it feels like a gift to me, a gift to the community. Again, anybody who feels called to be with you in this container, and just everybody listening, I feel like this is exactly what the world is precisely needing right now. So
you.
thank you. Yeah.
Blessings to you, Martha. Blessings to you, everyone who's listening.
Mm-hmm.